Oh. 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 How are you? And greetings from Niagara Falls and a joyous Father Figure Day to all. Unfortunately, we are lost in a cancel culture. And so, instead of canceling Father's Day, we can make this more inclusive by focusing on Father Figure Day. And that's what we did earlier this morning, where we celebrated our Pitra picnic. And many of the seekers who were part of this picnic shared how a father figure in their life was Swami Vivekananda. Most of you would not know that Swami Vivekananda, his body died when he was 39 years old. And there's lots of us who are 39 or older. Similarly, many shared that Swami Chinmayananda is a father figure to them. He started teaching when he was 35 years old. And I'm sharing this with all of you. Chinmaya Setukari is for those who are in their late 20s to early 40s generally. And this is a very potent age to serve. Serve like Swami Vivekananda, serve like Swami Chinmayananda. Today, that is June of 2021, we complete investing 3 years into the Chinmaya Setukari movement in North America, in the West. And this investment has been to empower us to serve those who are younger and to serve those who are older. The word Setukari means bridge, a bridge between those who are younger and those who are older. Our movement over the past 3 years has involved retreats. We've had retreats in Chicago and Raleigh, study groups that have been hosted by Washington, D.C., and then virtual, and media. We have a strong social media presence in terms of a WhatsApp group and a Google group. A highlight of the past 3 years has been our wellness mentorship program, which we're immersed in right now. This program has been a very efficient and effective way to serve those who are younger than us. I'm referring to all of the mentors. But in doing so, we're learning about ourselves and others so that we can serve those who are older than us. Do you agree? The more you learn about yourself and those who are younger, the more prepared you are to serve those who are older. Recently, our team of Nina and Pooja and Rashmi, Sheetal and Supriya, they came up with a impactful survey, and many of you filled in this survey, and I read every response, every detail of this. And I was overwhelmed by how much you appreciate this program, which shows how efficient and effective this is. Before we begin our workshop proper, I'm encouraging all of our mentors and mentees to encourage others to be mentors and mentees. We want this program to grow more and more and more because it's efficient, because it's effective. I think right now we have around 125 seekers who are part of this program, and we should keep growing this to 150 to 200. So keep spreading the word. If you think of the value add, the professional workshops that we've experienced just this year, Madhav facilitated a workshop on loneliness. And we're all struggling with that in terms of being locked in our homes. We've had a workshop on our identity that was facilitated by Nina. And we're rarely exposed to such thoughts and how much we learn from that. And now you're going to hear insights from Megha and Parag. And Megha and Parag were young adults like myself back in the day. And we studied together and we enjoyed together. And what's lovely is that Megha and Parag specifically are continuing to serve in the ways that I've described. With that, I will pause here and I will ask our team to continue with the introduction of Megha and Parag as they focus on managing perfectionism, and I will commune with all of you at the end of our workshop. How are you?
Hariom, everyone. Thank you for joining the session today. For those who don't know, this session is part of our wellness mentorship program, like Vivekji mentioned, and we're really excited to have Megha and Parag join us. Megha is actually one of our kind of lead meta mentors, I think is the name we're using. So she's overseeing a lot of aspects of the program and just ensuring that we're bringing the right mindset to it. So she's on our advisory panel. So we're really happy to have Megha and Parag here today. And I'll just turn it over to them to do introductions and to jump into content.
All right, everybody, and thank you so much for being here, and thank you to Vivekji for spearheading this program, and thank you for Chimay Siddhikari for arranging this. And yeah, just maybe just a brief introduction. My name is Parag. I'm actually Pooja's older brother, and it's my wife, Megha.
I'm Megha. Yeah. You're gonna say.
Yeah. So I'm so one of the things we want to talk about today is perfectionism, and we wanted to kind of bring in some of our insights as well as just the questions that we have. Both of us are actually practicing working in the mental health field. I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist in the Chicago suburbs, and
I'm a psychologist in private practice working with all different age range, mostly therapy work, cognitive behavioral therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy.
And so we've been recently, especially over the last year with everything going on, having to work with clients struggling with issues of perfectionism. And the more that we study it, the more that we look into it, the more that we see reflections of it in our own selves. And having to really look into it is something that we want to work on internally, but as well as with the people that we serve. We thought this would be an interesting topic to discuss, and we want to make it. We have some slides and just to kind of discuss some information, but we wanted to kind of make it informal, and to really be able to have you ask questions and discuss. So yeah, you should just get right to it.
Yep.
Okay, so we're going to try to share our screen. If you have any. All right. And so can you guys hear us first off? Yeah, okay. And you can see the screen is Managing Perfectionism, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect, okay. Yeah, so we can kind of jump right in. We wanted to talk about really working on a few things, and we'll start with just our pictures, how we used to look way back in the day. Back when I had black hair. So just some goals to start off. I wanted to kind of discuss what perfectionism is. Looking in the psychological literature, what is sort of the state of the art in discussing this, understanding some causes, and looking at the impact that it has on us in our lives, especially in our relationships with others. And then really talking about some learning tools to overcome perfectionism. And then most important, I think, is Q&A time, to really kind of be able to discuss and share ideas, because we want to learn as much as we want to be able to teach. So we can just kind of jump right in. And so what I wanted to do first is really get a sense of, okay, this word perfectionism, it's out there. Many of us have heard this word multiple times, and I wanted to get a sense, when you hear this, what comes to your mind? What are some just initial impressions that you get from that? Trying to see if I can see the chat, and maybe even put it in the chat. Any thoughts that you guys have, just type it right in. Right. Attention to detail, stress, detail-oriented, anxiety, pressure, perseverance, high expectations, anti-acceptance. Interesting, I like that one. Inability to handle what we perceive to be failure, externally successful, demanding, very high expectations, unrealistic expectations. Well, yeah. And those are kind of the same thoughts that we had when we were thinking about what perfectionism means. I think there's a bit of a negative bias to that, which I think is warranted, and we'll talk about that as we go through this. And these are some of the words that came to our mind when we were thinking, when we talk about perfectionism, what comes to our immediate mind. And so I wanted to kind of jump into definitions more from the psychological literature. And can you guys read this, or is it box? Yeah, okay. Just looking at the first one is more just the Merriam-Webster, sort of the standard definition. This kind of a disposition to regard anything short of perfection as unacceptable. The second one is kind of more of a standard psychological definition, a stable and consistent personality construct reflecting a powerful need to be perfect. What that means is perfectionism tends to be pretty stable throughout life. We often see it even in children, and this is where our clinical work comes in. Kids as young as toddler age often have perfectionistic traits, and that tends to continue long term, even until adulthood. And of these unrealistic expectations, that's one that kind of came up a lot in the chat. Outcome versus process-oriented thinking. We'll talk about more about this. Really kind of focusing on what the result of an action is, and as students of Vedanta, that's going to sound familiar as we talk about that. Versus the process and the values that we work on to get to any sort of outcome. A fear-based approach to challenges. When challenges arise, perfectionists tend to respond with a fear, or fear's cousin, anxiety. And then this is probably the more technical part of it. It's relational. So perfectionism doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in relation between at least two people, or one person and many more. If you can imagine someone sitting in an island in the middle of nowhere by themselves, you really have a hard time calling them a perfectionist, because what are they competing against, or what are they comparing themselves against? What's interesting in our society, and this is Western society I'm talking about, perfectionism is actually increasing significantly over time. So back in the early 1990s, a number of studies were done looking at kind of standard measures, looking at traits of perfectionism in college students. And then these studies were repeated and using the same tests again and again over the decades. And most recently, I believe 2016 was the most recent kind of massive study on that. And it's clear that the trends are increasing. No question about that. And across most Western countries, I don't have much data on, say, India or in the East in general. I think it'd be fascinating to maybe just discuss, but so why is that happening? What's causing the increase? And so I wanted to kind of, first off, one of the first things I always get when I talk about perfectionism is well, isn't that just high standards? And isn't that a good thing? Shouldn't we have high standards for ourselves? And the answer is yes, we should. We shouldn't sort of aim for low standards, but perfectionism we would classify as being different from having high standards. And one of the best ways to figure out the difference is really to kind of read through examples of underlying thoughts that are typical in perfectionism versus of those who have high standards. And so the first column on the left side, those are underlying beliefs of those who tend to have strong perfectionistic traits. So kind of, if you don't mind, read through that really quickly and then see what it feels like. What emotions kind of come up when you read through that column? Now try the second column on the right side. And this is looking at typical underlying beliefs with individuals who have high standards. How does it feel different? And I'd love any thoughts in the chat if you could. More space for growth. Left is more rigid. High standards is more reflective, more realistic. Fixed versus growth mindset. Yeah, absolutely. Cushion for flexibility. And that's what we were thinking too. This idea of flexibility versus rigidity is kind of crucial in understanding perfectionism and actually working through perfectionism. Self-forgiveness. Just trusting out. And one thing I wanted to bring up is I would be surprised if none of us, among all of us that are here, have never had some of the thoughts on the left column. And so one of the things we want to do is to say perfectionism isn't something that's to other people. It's something that we actually, all of us have had aspects of that in our lives. And so I'm sure if you read the left side, some of those thoughts probably sound familiar. And that's kind of part of just living in general in life. And so we'll talk about ways to kind of work through that as we go on. More of a technical slide again. This is how in a lot of the literature they kind of chop up and examine perfectionism. This is kind of the autopsy slide. What does it look like when you kind of cut it apart? And I wanted to really talk about the first three: self-oriented, other-oriented, and socially prescribed. And we'll kind of just jump into that a bit more in detail. And so self-oriented, so the orientation is, where is the pressure coming from for being perfect? Okay. So self-oriented is kind of the classic one that we all think of when you think of perfectionism, is this feeling I need to be perfect, this feeling of I have this very strong evaluation of myself. I require myself to be perfect. And often the core beliefs that you see in individuals, or all of us who, when we experience this, is, I feel I'm tied my value to my success. So if I fail, I have less value as a human being. A big one is I can't make mistakes. And mistakes are a sign of weakness. And nothing matters more than being the best. And what are the results of that? Oftentimes, as we get into this mindset and we work extra hard at the expense of things that we really value, compulsivity in our work, checking assignments or tasks again and again. And denial is a big one, because this thought of, if I make a mistake, there's something wrong with me. What oftentimes that leads to is, if I make a mistake, then I try to hide it. And so lying is very, very common when we get into this mode. Lies of omission, lies of commission, really to deny any mistakes that are made. And then this is really relevant more for school and work, especially procrastination. Because we want to do things in that mind, when we're in that mindset, we want to do things perfectly. And if I can't do it perfectly, I'm going to not do it at all. And you can imagine what happens with that is then tasks start getting left, or, I'm not going to do the dishes, and I just kind of end up to a point where I'm procrastinating quite a bit. And so procrastination is actually very strongly tied to perfectionism. So let's see. Other-oriented. So this is, the first one was the self. The pressure's coming in from the self. The second one is other-oriented. So the pressure is from the self to others. And this is where someone is really kind of putting a lot of pressure on other people. There's a strong requirement that other people be perfect. And that's often causing strong criticism, just very stringent evaluations of other people. And you can imagine how that might affect relationships, right? There's this idea that the belief everyone should meet my expectations, or kind of the flip side of that, people are not worth, giving any responsibility to, because everyone's going to fail me. only I can do it, that idea. These individuals that, or when we get into these modes, we often take a lot of responsibility. We don't delegate. We are very critical of others. We make excessive demands, and then we often micromanage. Again, because there's a belief that other people are going to be just not good enough for my standards. And you can imagine that causes a lot of difficulty in the relationship and in oneself. And socially prescribed. This is the third category, the third way of kind of chopping up perfectionism. This is a belief, the drive for the perfectionism comes from the outside. And so this is the society has too perfect standards for me, or my family standards are too high, or my work standards are too high. I can't keep up with that. So we feel oppressed by some other entity, often in society, that's kind of putting it on this. That's a lot of it is I must live up to other standards, approval seeking, and behaviors that we see with this is going to great lengths to please others, frequent checking, reassurance seeking, excessive apologizing. Does that sound familiar to anyone? Just kind of almost to the point where you're apologizing more than like, why did I even apologize for that? And a big one is putting on a facade in public, and you often see this in families or in small companies. Where you put on a facade, pretend like everything's fine, and unfortunately the result of that is then if issues arise, if problems are there, then they don't get talked about, they don't get dealt with, because it's important to keep the image versus actually solve problems. This is too eerily familiar. Hey, that's I'm glad we're discussing it, right? I think this is relevant for all of us. So the question then becomes, where does perfectionism come from? And there's just many, many, many different theories about this. And a lot of this is technical as well, so we may not get into it too deep, but a lot of it seems to be tied, or many of the theories are kind of related to this sense of what we call asynchrony in responses. So basically the needs of a child, especially thinking young kids, are really love, acceptance, a sense of belonging to their parents, to their community, to their family and their friends, as we go to school, to our teachers and coaches, teammates, a sense of belonging that's there. It's a very natural human need. And when that need is thwarted, for whatever reason, there's asynchrony, they're not in connection. The child or the young adult or adolescent, they develop these strategies to try to avoid rejection. And that's the key term in this kind of busy slide. Avoiding rejection is, and really working on a strategy to avoid rejection is thought to be one of the core underlying processes by which perfectionism arises. And so you have this working model of I'm unlovable. I've been rejected by others, or I tried to reach out, I didn't get acceptance or care or love or attention. So there must be something wrong with me. And by darn it, I'm going to make sure I get that acceptance and care. And so I'm going to form these strategies to try to seek that from others. And once in a while, that's very normal, right? We all do this to some degree, but when it becomes a persistent habit, again and again and again, rinse and repeat, I'm trying to seek approval from others because I don't feel like I get it in any other way, then that becomes a habit after a while. And habits eventually become personality. And that's when we tend to see perfectionism really kind of take over somebody. Now, it isn't all just individual. A lot of the other theories are looking more at societal norms and cultural norms. As mentioned earlier, perfectionism is on the rise in the West, especially. And we have this significant pressure to be perfect or look like we're perfect. I think social media only has made this worse. We, in our culture, at least in the West, we reward self-confidence, for example. And self-confidence, if not necessarily earned, can be more of putting on an image, right? And that can that can be driven by perfectionistic type thinking. So it seems that individualistic or meritocratic cultures may have higher rates of perfectionism compared to collective cultures overall. And part of that is because we have certain views of success that are rewarded and reinforced. And then, of course, naturally, people want to seek that. And then you kind of get into that loop of, if I don't get it, if I don't get that approval, I'm going to find strategies to get that. I'm going to reinforce that, finding strategies, and then perfections results. And so if you have any questions, I know it's kind of maybe a bit technical to some degree, but if any questions about that, please put it in the chat. I'm happy to answer them.
And I think the media too, right? We're going to talk about.
Yeah.
Yeah, the media has a role too, Facebook and all of that.
It's a big part. It seems to be a big part. It seems to be an increasing part of it. Now, a lot of the studies on perfectionism interestingly enough, come from Canada. I don't know, Canada is sort of the hotbed in the psychological literature of perfectionism research. So to you Canadians out there, thank you for doing that. It seems to be a lot of the studies kind of end in the late 2010s, and so I think right before the onset of significant social media. So I think we're going to learn more about that. So it's still being kind of worked out, but there definitely seems to be a trend that social media seems to be maybe related to perfectionism, especially inadequacy. This idea, like I mentioned, internal rejection being internalized, leading to inadequacy. I wanted to highlight in this the constant attentiveness to markers of non-acceptance. And why is that important? This is often what poisons relationships that we have, whether it's parent-child, whether it's sibling relationships, work relationships, etc., friendships. When we are in a perfectionistic mindset, we are constantly looking for markers from other people to see if they're judging us, or to see if there's any risk of rejection. And when we find that, okay, they like us, they seem like we're cool with them, there's a relief there, because we're kind of looking, we're sort of tense, there's a tension around that. Are we accepted? Are we okay? Yes, we are. Okay, good. And that relief is extremely intoxicating, for lack of a better word. And that often drives further perfectionistic actions, because you want that relief. It's chasing a high, basically, at least theorized to be. And just like any drug, you get that sense of relief, then you want it more, and you want it more, and you want it more, and then again you get into this pattern where that becomes the habit. So
just the chat is lots of stuff going on in the chat.
Okay. I love it. Yeah. How does one observe indicators that they're causing asynchrony? And we'll talk about that at the end. We do want to talk specifically about children and parents and children. Perfection can be relative. Interesting question. I think everyone has their own sort of model for perfection, which is not relative, but the fact that everyone has their own makes it relative, if that makes sense. So, and so this is kind of the standard, one of the big standard models in the literature. We're not going to go into this, but in case you're interested, this research team has kind of put together just how all of it kind of puts together, it kind of goes together to create these perfectionistic trends. So the impact. So how does perfectionism affect us? And a lot of this we're beginning to talk about. I'll start at the bottom on the self. So how does perfectionism impact me? The more that I engage in that type of mindset, the more inadequacy is there, right? Because inadequacy is what's really driving it. And that leads to a sense of imposter, or feeling like an imposter. Imposter syndrome is a very common sort of feeling that I think a lot of us, especially in the professional world, have, and in the parenting world have. We see our parents as being experts. We're like, we have no idea what we're doing. And part of that is because of a chronic comparative mindset. That's back to that seeking attunement, or seeking acceptance, and being very attuned to the search for acceptance. What that does over time is cause somebody to be focused only on that. Am I being accepted by others? Am I being liked by others? And so the mindset is just comparison, comparison, comparison. And you can imagine that has a negative impact on one's own self-esteem, but also one's ability to really pursue other joys in life. And we're seeing in the more in the mental health treatment side of things, significant link between depression, especially eating disorders, anxiety, and then OCD related to perfectionistic traits. The impact on relationships, and again, perfectionism has to occur in relation. It can only occur in relationships. Controlling behavior, whether that's at home, at school, in the work environment. Reading into motives of others. A lot of times, and Megha will talk about this in a little bit, but this idea of mind reading. We have assumptions about how other people are acting, and which is normal again, that's how we sort of interact with each other. But if we're looking at it from a perfectionistic mindset, then those assumptions are very tied to this idea, this fear of what if they're not going to like me? What if I'm, do I have to keep comparing myself or do something more to kind of get their acceptance? And then again, impact on school. A big one is procrastination in children and in the workplace, frankly, but also underachievement. Because if I can't, do things perfectly, then I don't do them at all, or I put off tasks, and I just don't live up to my potential. A lot of times when we work with schools, the teachers will tell us, we have this kid, he's brilliant, or she's wonderful, but she's not living up to her potential. And when you actually get to meet them over time, you really see a perfectionism mindset that's there. And you wonder, that's a big part of maybe why they're not meeting that potential, that teachers would see that, think they should be able to do without any problem. And then difficulty working with others, which again, because it's so relational, it makes sense that would cause just impairments in a relationship. So overcoming perfectionism, this is the part that we're all waiting for. So before we even go into that though, what we'd like to do is have everyone just take a minute to think of a situation that you personally have gone through where you've had some of those perfectionistic thoughts or feelings. And so you kind of know what they are, and we sort of touched on it a little bit. I'd almost say, if you want to close your eyes and think of it, sort of imagine yourself in that moment as it's happening. And then ask the question, how long have these thoughts been there? Is it something that was there? Can you trace that back to when you were a small kid? Or was it maybe after some difficult situations arose in your life? Where do they come from? And who in your life demonstrated similar beliefs? Why do you think you accepted their beliefs? And so if you've seen that modeled from others, why do you think you've accepted that? And the last question, as we're sort of imagining ourselves as a perfectionist, what would be the consequences of changing that? Or what would have been the consequences back then if we approached it differently? And so hopefully that kind of brings maybe more of an esoteric concept to our own lives. That's really where it gets interesting, is how do we sort of fit into this? So Megha?
Okay, I will take over the next part. So as we're, you just went through an exercise where you're kind of looking at your own thoughts and just your experience with perfectionism. So what are the common thoughts and beliefs that are running in your head? And a lot of the times, what you just reflected on, some of those thoughts have been there with you for a long time, right? When I work with patients, they say, oh, this thought has been with me for 30 years, right? So it's like this narrative that has been with you for a long time, and you don't even know that you have that narrative, right? And so what are these thoughts? These thoughts are a lot of times unworkable thoughts, especially when we're thinking about perfectionism. They're self-critical thoughts, feeling of inadequacy, doubt about one's ability. There can also be cognitive distortions, just there's a maladaptive way of thinking about things, right? So a lot of shoulds. I should be perfect. I should be the best daughter. I should be the best mom, whatever those shoulds are in your life, right? Or all or nothing thinking, right? If I fail this test, I'm a loser, or I'm never gonna succeed in life, or I'll be a bum, or whatever that is, right? It's like this or that. Selective attention or telescoping. So forget about the 99% that you got on the test. It's that 1% where you missed that one problem. That's what you're gonna focus on. So these are just some of them. There's a whole list of them, but these are some of the common ones that show up when we're talking about perfectionism. So what is my relationship to these kinds of thoughts, right? So a common one, I'm not good enough, or I'm never good enough, right? A perfectionist thought. So our relationship when we are in this mode is we treat these thoughts as literal binding truth. We mistake them as us. This is me. I am never good enough, right? You kind of, if this is you and this is a thought, you're like combined. There's no space between it. You become that thought. And then it doesn't feel good, right? So there's rumination, thinking, well, how can I be more perfect, right? And then that feeling, to have that thought, to be with that thought is very painful. So you try to avoid it. So what do we do, at least with the thoughts, right? So we have to change our relationship with thoughts. And the first step, just kind of like the exercise that Parag did, is we have to increase our awareness about what's going on in our minds, right? What are the thoughts that are there, right? So mindfulness, meditation, all of those things can help us become more aware of the types of thoughts that we're having, right? And our job is to, or what we're trying to do is we're trying to take an observer position, right? So can we sit back, have some space, and kind of witness what the thoughts are and let the thoughts come and go, right? Without engaging them. You don't need to argue with them. You don't need to prove them wrong. You don't need to get validation from your mom or anybody that I'm okay, right? Like, or friend. You just kind of let them kind of come and go. And then there are lots of other techniques out there in acceptance and commitment therapy world where you can actively create more space. So one example would be you write down for 5 minutes, you record all the thoughts that you're having, and you start the sentence, each sentence with "I'm having thought." So that's like an acknowledgement that I'm the one having this thought. I'm not the thought, but I'm having thought, right? So you write it all down, you know, whatever pops up in your head, and then you read it 4 or 5 times, and then you try to, based on the thought, come up, what is the story that's being told? And you name the story, right? Or another way to think about it is, if I were to make a movie out of these thoughts, what would be the title of the movie? And then as you go on with your life and these thoughts are coming, as soon as you notice them, you just say, oh, here's that story playing again. And the story has been with me for 30 years or 5 years, whatever amount of time you've had it. And right away, by doing that, you're already creating space because you're unhooking from that thought and saying, oh, this is a narrative that's being played in my head, and it's a common one that's always been there, right? The other thing about thought is a thought is just a thought. It's not like we've been saying, it's not the truth. It's not, you know, it's just a thought. Like when you do meditation or mindfulness technique, it's amazing how the mind is just like this computer that just keeps spitting out information or different things. And a lot of times some of the thoughts don't even make sense. They're so random, right? So, but to believe that, that is who we are, can get us, especially if it's an unworkable thought where, you know, we're saying I'm not good enough. That's gonna really make it difficult for us to live a good life, right? So a thought is just a thought, and you have a choice whether you want to engage with it. And the key question here is the thought working for me? Is it helping me live the life that I want to live? And if it's not helping me live the life that I want to live, then we don't need to engage with it. If it's helping you, great, then follow it and do what you need to with that. But if it's not helping you, then yeah, you just leave it. Again, this is easier said than done. And you know the mind is a monkey mind, right? It just spits out a lot of different things. So it's probably one of the harder skills to develop. But it can be done over time. So what are the emotions that are part of perfectionism, right? One of the key things that we see in anxiety and then also perfectionism is this intolerance for uncertainty. So as humans, we don't like it when we don't know what's going to happen, right? When we don't know for sure what's going on, right? It's aversive. So one way to find relief, right, is to try to control our future. So to get the best job, to save up so that retirement will be good, right? Exercise so my health will be good, later on. But the reality is we can do those things, and yeah, it may help, right? But to some degree, we don't have control over what's going to happen, even a minute from now, right? Life happens, and there's so many things we cannot control. So for perfectionism, they try to control, like they engage in controlling behavior to get this relief from this aversive feeling of uncertainty. And same thing with anxiety too. But the tricky part here, the paradox of uncertainty, is the more we try to gain a sense of certainty, the less tolerance we have of the uncertainty, right? So it's like you're just getting caught up in it. It's controlling you. And then a lot, like Parag said, there's a lot of things that we see when someone is trying to control their every behavior in perfectionism, and they're right there on the screen. I think we went over some of that. So. Okay, and then broadly, kind of even extending it out. So we talked about one type of feeling that we don't like, right? But in general, what is our relationship with emotions that we don't like? I mean, the society is very good about, happily ever after, like calm, happy, like all those things we embrace, right? But what do we do about guilt, shame? You know, what do we do about anxiety, right? Those are things that I think a lot of times we don't know what to do with. And the question is always, are you going towards it, or are you running away from it, avoiding it? And most of us, if it doesn't feel good, you want to avoid it, right? So that's what experiential avoidance is. You avoid these painful things because it's just, we don't know how to deal with them, right? We don't know how to hold it or be with it. For perfectionism, the desire is that they want to be perfect, but as we know from the definition, it's unattainable. So then when it's unattainable, how does the person feel? They're self-criticizing themselves, or there's self-doubt, and then you want to withdraw. It's too painful from that unpleasant experience. And then the perfectionistic behavior itself is used to deny and distract from these internal unwanted thoughts and feelings that are being experienced. And then like working long hours or rechecking, redoing, procrastination, all the things we've been talking about. Let's see. So what do we do with these uncomfortable emotions or sensations, right? So here's a graph. The x-axis is time, and then the y-axis is anxiety level. So imagine that you're in 5th grade and you have to do a presentation in front of your class, right? I mean, we all been there, right? Like even now, there's some level of anxiety that I'm feeling, right? Just being here. So imagine you're stepping out of the house and then you start feeling this anxiety and you don't know what that is. And you're like, Mom, I'm not feeling good. And Mom doesn't know about the presentation, so she lets you stay home, right? And so temporarily, the anxiety goes down, right? Avoidance helped. And so now the brain thinks that, oh, the way to get rid of the anxiety is just avoid the situation, right? And so then the next day comes along, same thing, the assignment is still there and the person is feeling the same thing. Again, they stay home. Now, each day they stay home, the peak of anxiety is going to be higher. The anxiety is just getting higher and higher. And the message that the brain is getting is that there's something really wrong. Like this presentation is life or death. It's like, it's very like, you get very fearful. Like it's becoming this big thing now, right? So instead, imagine what would happen if, Mom knows about the presentation. She's like, no, you gotta go. It doesn't matter the first day, right? So then you go and the anxiety goes up, 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 up. And then you get to that peak. It's very uncomfortable. You still do it. You experience all of it. And then you come down, right? And you didn't use your safety behavior, right? You didn't avoid the situation. You went through it. And the more you do it, the more what ends up happening is the peak gets less and less. It doesn't mean that you're not going to experience those feelings. It's just now you're better at handling it. And you know that you don't need the safety behaviors to get through it, right? So with perfectionism, it's the same thing. We can practice being imperfect. So sending that email with typo or that text with typo, right? Do it over and over again until it becomes boring and there's no physical sensation or any like, oh, I'm stupid thought or anything. What are they going to think of me thought that comes through? So you can actually engage in these kinds of exercises to help you become more, get better at these situations that create this feeling in you. Okay, so another process that we can talk about when we're dealing with this is acceptance and self-compassion, right? A key aspect of perfectionism is self-criticism. So self-compassion is the opposite. It's a healthy way of connecting to oneself, right? So it allows you to be open to and moved by your own suffering, right? It helps you accept these difficult internal experiences that you're having. And the 3 components of it, if we break it down, is mindfulness. Again, like we did before, the first step is awareness. Like what is showing up for me, right? And then a piece of that is we're not going to judge what shows up, right? We're just experiencing what's showing up. And then what would happen if we shifted the narrative a little bit, right? So these experiences that are coming up, these uncomfortable experiences, what if that's common to everybody, right? Like, I'm not good enough storyline. There's some version of that storyline that we're all experiencing, right? But we just don't talk about it. But what if we knew that everybody had some version of that? Then we would feel that I'm not alone in this pain and suffering, right? That imperfection, those imperfections, faults, and difficulties are universal. We all have something that we're carrying in our backpack that's heavy, right? And then the third component is self-kindness. And I think this is probably the hardest thing for most people. And it's the thing in therapy when I'm working with people, it's like they struggle with this. So how do I treat myself when I'm my most vulnerable, right? Like if I'm feeling shame or guilt, what do I do? Do I bully myself more? Do I make it worse for myself, right? Do I beat myself up for that? Or do I actually treat it like, okay, this is a friend that's going through this, or it's my child that's going through this. Our response to other people when they're going through this is so much different than when it is us, right? We're much kinder to other people when we hear these struggles. So I think what we're working towards is, can I create a safe space for myself to experience these things, right? And if you can do that, then it doesn't matter what comes your way, you're able to kind of get through whatever shows up, right? So this is an exercise. The Reign of Selfcompassion it kind of walks you through some of these steps. And we don't have a lot of time to go over this, but I'll just give you the acronyms. This is by Parag. And so the first step is just recognize what's going on in the moment. And then allow the experience. A is for allowing the experience to be there, just as it is. And then I is investigate with interest and care. Well, what if this thing is showing up? What is it telling me? What is it needing from me? You know. And then N is for nurture. Nurture with self-compassion. What does it? How can I be there for it? Right. And we put some resources on there that will kind of, you can go there and it can give you more information about these steps. And there's also a resource of her going through the meditation. We wanted to do the meditation today, but I don't think we have enough time. But it's a 10-minute meditation that kind of walks you through this whole process. So if you're having difficulty with something, you can listen to it, and she'll kind of help you with this. Okay, so I know in the previous slides we talked about sometimes the thoughts, we mistake the thoughts for us, right? That's who I am. So a conceptualized self, right, it can be anything. It could be my role as a mom or a sister or a daughter or whatever, a psychologist, right? So it can include roles, thoughts, emotions, memories, stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves, right? And any of those different things. In perfectionism, the identity a lot of the times is shaped by, like Parag said, more by outcomes, right? So good grades, specific titles or awards, or a raise in pay, approval from others. That's a big one, right? As we've been talking about. But the issue with this is that a lot of these variables that we conceptualize ourselves as us are very transient. They come in, they change, right? Our situation changes. Our thoughts, emotions, moment by moment are different, right? So if we rely on these to define who we are, then we're at the mercy of whatever is happening in these different aspects. So if things are going well, wow, I feel good about myself. But if things are not going well, then I don't feel good about myself, right? It's just a lot of up and down kind of thing. So what we want to do is we want to loosen this loosening of the conceptualized sense of self, right? So creating more space with our thoughts or emotions or memories, right? Roles, right? Having a little bit of space. And then the one thing that is constant and that's unchanging is very Vedantic, and there's different, they call it observer self, right? But we have different terms for that. It's that person that's experiencing that awareness, right? That consciousness, that's that person who's experiencing these things, that always stays the same, right? That awareness piece. So I think identifying more with that or stepping into that, and mindfulness can really help with that. can help you create that space where these things come and go, but you don't get rattled by it, because you're just sitting there in that observer self, kind of watching what's going on. And then, so that's one aspect. So now we're like, well, okay, if you take away my outcomes and you take away my goals, then who am I, right? And even self, to some degree, I just said that, right? So who am I? Like, I need something, right? So values can be really helpful in this. So what is most important to me in my life? And here are some examples of it, right? For each person, it's going to be different. So we'll go a little bit more into that. So values are basically a compass that helps us live the life that we want to live, right? And they're not goals or outcomes. They're broader, constant, overarching principles that provide a sense of purpose in life. They're not this full stop, once I achieve it, it's done. It's more of a way of living, right? Where it's a lifelong process that's happening, right? So one moment I may be completely engaged in a value-based behavior, and then the next moment I may slip to those thoughts that I'm having. And then I have to, again, once the awareness is there, then I can go back to doing those value-based things, right? So that's the beauty of it, that even if you fail one moment, you can go back and get connected to it and then keep striving, right? It's a lifelong thing. For when we think about perfectionism, it's important to differentiate values that are influenced by perfectionism versus deeper principles that guide our life, right? And when we're able to do this, it creates a positive sense of motivation and fulfillment. So it's one thing to identify what the values are, but just identifying is not enough, because that's not what's going to change our lives necessarily. I think what's really going to help is, am I engaging in behaviors that are consistent with my values, right? So for perfectionism, it may be that the values are lost because they're so caught up in all this other stuff, right? So now they're not really living the life they want to live, right? Because the uncomfortable thoughts, feelings, and sensations are getting in the way, and they're just caught up in that. And that's not, that's avoiding a lot of the things that they may have cared about without the perfectionism. So what we want to do is, no matter what the internal experience is, whether it's depression or anxiety or perfectionism, the key thing is, well, we still have to keep moving in the direction of what we want, what's important to us. And we take some of these uncomfortable, painful parts of us with us as we're doing it. And the more we do it, the more those voices will kind of, it won't be as loud, because you're doing the things that you care about. But we can't expect that they're going to be gone, because the more you do the things you care about, the more some of these voices might be there. Because if there's no pain, then you don't really care about some of these things that you're doing. So it's almost like you have to figure out a way to, not friends, but make room for these things that are part of things that we don't like. Yeah.
I know in the interest of time, we just have a few more minutes, but wanted to kind of more specifically look at parenting. This is something that as Hippocaries, we're kind of very much in that role. Key takeaways from this is really modeling our behavior. And so when you have kids that are beginning to take on some of those perfectionistic traits, they're really going to be looking to the adults in their lives to see how can they manage that. What do they sort of value? What do adults value as being quote unquote success that I need to achieve? And so very much we need to be observant of what our own expectations are, to kind of go through what Megha was talking about of assessing the values, becoming aware of where our own stuff is coming up, and then really asking that question in the interactions. What do I expect to get out of this encounter with this child? And asking that again and again and again. Then there's some typical. Oftentimes we talk about focusing on the efforts made versus the outcome gained, reframing challenges as adventures in one's life. We're driving and we get lost, and then looking at it as an adventure versus getting flipping out about it and becoming upset. Children are very much attuned to that, and they're going to be watching for our behavior and our responses. And we really need to be, as parents, understanding that not only are we sort of our behavior affects them, but Also, the other oriented perfectionism can play a role in their development. If we're critical of them, it creates another generation of perfectionism, essentially, to raise up, and then we have the opportunity to stop that. Real briefly, I know that we're getting close to the end of time. In the workplace, kind of what Megha was talking about earlier, really assessing values. What kind of work do I want to be? Not so much what are my endpoints, have I hit my marks this quarter? Not so much that but as of, am I living the values as a worker that I wish to? And if not, what can I do to work on that? Really kind of discussing losses in competitive situations. I think a lot of workplaces and schools, frankly, as well, there isn't really any talk about when things don't go well, and really kind of making sure that we talk about, okay, I don't really know what I'm doing here. I made some mistakes. Can we discuss this in a way to kind of open up that space, not only in ourselves, but then with others, that it's okay to have things that don't go well, and can we talk about that? Geeta, raise your hand. Sorry. I think probably maybe time. Okay, last slide, I promise. And then in relationships, we talked a little bit about this as well. Basic takeaway from this, looking at the avoidance of uncomfortable thoughts in relationships. Oftentimes we avoid conflict because we don't want, conflict is seen as the relationship is not going well. And that's a perfectionist trait that's there. Conflict is healthy. Conflict is normal in human relationships. The more we avoid it, the more, and not engage in an unhealthy way, the more that perfectionism can kind of spoil the relationship. So we'll end there. I know we're at the end of time. I think the team had some announcements to discuss.
Yes. So thank you so much, Parag and Megha. It's so awesome to see how you're weaving together Vedanta and your experiences in your workplace and as psychologists and psychiatrists. And I know there's a lot of nodding on the call and a lot of people who can relate. So this is very much needed. And we're going to keep the conversation going. We're going to make a couple of quick announcements and do sort of a formal end to the session, but we will continue for another half hour. We'll have time for Q&A and discussion. So let's if you go to the next slide, there's going to be a couple of announcements, and then I'll hand it over to Vivekji. Next slide. So like I mentioned, this is part of the Wellness Mentorship Program. So all the mentors and mentees on, so awesome to have you all. We're going to be meeting again our next meeting will be July 18th. And we're actually just going to get together as mentors and mentees, discuss the program, how things are going, best practices, tips. I know there's a lot of questions we all have, and we just want to have some satsang and discussion. So please hold Sunday, July 18th, and we'll share more of the details for that. And then if you go to the next slide, just a couple of other kind of retreats coming up and opportunities for satsang. June 21st to 24th, so starting tomorrow, Vivekji is leading a workshop on holistic habits. So as you re-enter the workplace or kind of the real world post-COVID, there's a great opportunity to, look back at some of your habits and develop healthy habits, in the coming weeks and months and in the near future. So that's coming up. And then if we go to the next slide, finally, the Mahasamadhi virtual retreat is coming up. So July 29th to August 2nd, there is a Chick and CSK retreat led by Vivekji. So we'll also share some of the details in the chat, but save the date for that for some Mahasamadhi satsang. And then I'll hand it over to Vivekji for our close, and then we'll open it up for Q&A and discussion.
Right on, Pooja. My gratitude to all of you for being part of this workshop and being part of our program. I had mentioned, and I continue to mention how important this is. Maybe one of our team members will look into how many people are part of this program, the mentors and mentees. So if you can check that up and then share in the chat, how many people are part of this program, that would be quite inspiring. My gratitude to our team. I'd mentioned their names earlier. I'm just going alphabetically. Nina and Rashmi. And then Pooja, Sheetal Supriya. Please forgive me if I'm missing anyone. So this is our team that has really facilitated this program and so much of the work that has been done over the past 3 years. And my gratitude to Megha and Parag. This is such a fundamental topic, and Pooja had mentioned that they're sharing this in terms of Vedanta and professionally, but also experientially as parents. And naturally, we can share that same relationship with young kids. How it's complex to want the best for anyone you care for, whether you're a parent or not, yet not to succumb to attachment. This is super complex. And having an approach from different perspectives, whether from a medical perspective or a scientific perspective or a Vedantic perspective, makes this much more practicable, realizable. So my gratitude in many directions, and do continue to participate in this program, spread the word, and the retreats that Pooja just mentioned in terms of in Calgary and Washington, DC. Be part of that and spread the word and stay on. I've asked Megha to share the guided quietude that she was just talking about, whether that's done now or later, but the Q&A will be very impactful. Everyone sitting comfortably. Shanti, Shanti, Shantihi. Be safe, be sound, be serene, be happiness. Megha and Parag, please continue.
Hariom, we would love to answer any questions, and we would like to do the meditation then maybe at the end, if that's okay, Vivekji. We'll just play. I think the link is on YouTube and our slides. We'll just click it and hopefully it works.
Or did you want us to do it first, Vivekji?
I think if you do it at the end, it will be better.
Okay.
And the questions will be more live and interactive. And Archana and Siddharth naturally are the first to ask a question. So you can connect with them, okay?
Awesome.
Okay.
Hari Om, Parag and Megha. Thank you for that. That was a presentation that made us both extremely uncomfortable to listen to because you could relate to so much of it. My question is more from a parenting perspective. And I don't know if I'm just looking for validation or for actual professional tips here in terms of, is there any coming back from once you've realized that there's a lot of this behavior that we've exhibited towards our kids, maybe unknowingly, and now that we have that awareness, at what point is it too late? Or have we already scarred them and there's no coming back?
I don't think it's ever too late. I think it's always like going back to those values, like what is most important to you in your relationship with your child, right? So I think you start there. Once you identify that moment to moment, connect with them, in that moment, becoming aware of what's coming up for you, whatever those pressures are, whatever, right? And in that moment, choosing to go from a place of values, right? And choosing how you want to be, whatever that is, right, with the child. And the more and more you do that, each experience you have with your child can reshape your relationship or reshape how you are with your child. So I don't think it's ever too late. There's always, that's the beauty of this, right? You have your whole life to kind of keep working on that relationship, as long as you're able to identify what's most important to you. Do you want to add something?
Sure, and I think as we were talking about maybe as I was talking about a bit earlier, it is in the repair that the child learns how to repair themselves. In the repair that you do, I mean. And so if you're able to really honestly, openly, with that deep sense of truth, say, this is, I regret that I did this and I want to make things better. On one level, you're creating that repair, but then you're also teaching the child how to repair themselves. And so there's benefits both ways there. Other questions?
Megha and Parag, thank you very much for a lovely presentation. I have two questions. So you might have answered this in brief, but I wanted to explore this a bit further. As a parent, how do you observe that you as a parent are causing this asynchrony with your child? So what are the indicators that one would look for? So that's one. The second is, if you can go deeper into principles versus perfectionism. When does one following their principles in life and really committing to those values become a segue into perfectionism?
Answer the second one. You can go first.
No, go ahead.
Well, I can answer the second one. So in general, values are not supposed to be rigid, right? They're supposed to be flexible. There's no one way to do something. So as soon as it feels like it's getting too rigid or it's becoming not flexible, then that means that we're kind of moving away from the values. It's becoming something else.
I think joy being a factor. So I think if like perfectionistic values, they don't feel joyful. They feel anxiety. They feel driven by anxiety, driven by fear. True values feel joyful when you engage in them, and I think that could be a gauge. Am I joyful or am I not joyful? Or am I joyful or am I anxious in doing this? That could be one way to sort of to look at that. And I guess with the asynchrony. It's a challenging question, and I think oftentimes what you'll see is kids will make, even infants will make little, we call bids for attention, or bids for connection. That little smile, that gaze in your direction, and we're busy doing, we're doing the dishes or something like that. We can't sort of engage with them in the moment. It takes a certain number of bids before the child says, "Okay, this is a failure. This is what I'm doing to try to get this attention is not sufficient." And that's when they start to create that sense of, okay, there's something wrong with me, because why wouldn't my parent love me? I mean, parents are supposed to do that, aren't they? And so that's why I think looking at those bids for attention, those sort of very subtle engagements, simple as a head nod, simple as a look in your direction, all of it is very primitive, very sort of baseline level. This isn't, oh, I bought them something fancy, nothing like that. This is, they looked at me, they shared this moment with me, and I shared it back with them. That's where that synchrony is developed, and when that gets lost, when you're missing out on those bids, that's when you tend to see more asynchrony.
Hariom, thank you so much for the presentation. I think the entire time I was listening and like feeling like this is directly relatable to me. Like I felt a little bit called out, but in a good way. And I had two questions. So my first question was, a lot of the times I'll feel myself applying this perfectionism to things that should theoretically be good for my self-development. Like I'll find myself treating my sadhana or my even just like regular self-development in a perfectionist kind of way, where I feel like, oh, like I'm not doing this as good as I should be. Like I messaged Nina earlier this weekend because I signed up to do something, and then I was like, oh my gosh, like I feel like I'm not going to be able to do this as well as I should be. So my first question is, how do you handle perfectionism related to things that are actually good for your self-development? And then my second question is, I don't know if this is a common feeling, but I think a real reason for why perfectionism is so strengthened in my life is because I've felt myself externally rewarded for it. Like because of my perfectionism, people notice that I have attention to detail and I like achieve good grades typically and stuff. And so it's hard to separate the rewards I'm getting in the external world from the perfectionism that I put on myself. And so how do I approach that? Thank you.
Like you said, the second part, I think focusing on process versus outcome, I think is very helpful there. Because you're absolutely right, and that's one of the reasons why perfectionism is created, is because society rewards those traits to some degree. And I guess that leads to the first part of the question, where our sadhana, our practice, how can that can kind of turn into a perfectionism. And I think we see that sometimes where there isn't a sense of purpose to it. There's a sense I'm doing this because I have to, or because I feel pressured to. There isn't a sense that this is meaningful for me. And I think that the more that we can shift it back to this is meaningful, this, this puja that I'm doing, or this, whatever it may be, this meditation, I'm doing it because it's meaningful for me versus I'm doing it because I have to. The analogy I might use is with exercise. It's something that I, struggle oftentimes with, getting motivated to do. And I'm doing it because, my stupid watch is telling me I have to do it now because it's the time to do it, or am I doing it because I actually want to go for a run and it's beautiful outside and the birds are chirping? Same activity, but just the meaning makes the difference.
Yeah, I mean, I would also, if you didn't do it, what are the feelings that are popping up? Like, what's going on there? Like, is there guilt, shame? I mean, you don't have to answer that, but I think you would look at those feelings too, and that will also give you more information about the motivation, right? If it's turning into more outcome-based versus more of a process, right? Because yeah, I mean, and even with spirituality, or even when you're doing meditating, right? Like we think, oh, I'm gonna have a perfect meditation. There's no such thing, right? So with spirituality, it doesn't need to be perfect, right? As long as you're doing something, right? Then I think, and if you're committed to it, then you're gonna continue to do it, even if you have some times that you fail to do it, right? So yeah, but sitting with those feelings can give you, maybe it's bringing up the same stuff that in other parts of your life, right? So you're just carrying that over to your spirituality too, and that pattern can help to kind of break it a little bit.
Definitely very relatable, like everyone else was saying. So yeah, just one question. So this happened many years ago. I was working at a place where I was a little bit nervous on my first week about, making sure that I did my job properly. So I asked a few questions, maybe more than what I should have, and I got told off for that by my manager at the time. And I was just like, seriously? I can't even ask questions here. But then it sounded as though, that it was just like the kind of environment where they expected you to be like super, like good at like everything. And thankfully the roles I've had after that were not like that. I've had very, very good, roles where it's not perfectionist, where, it's basically a high standards. But my question basically is, should, you ever be thrust in an environment like that where they are kind of perfectionists and making mistakes basically means that you've screwed up entirely? Like, what should your approach in general be?
And so one thought with that is their appraisal may or may not change, and especially in the workplace, dealing with others in perfectionism, we're not going to change others' behavior. Almost never happens, and so the only thing we have control over in that situation is how important am I going to rate their criticism of me. I can take bits and pieces of it that say, okay, maybe I am asking too many questions in this, and okay, that's something I can learn from. But if my feelings of myself are based on their appraisal, I'm going to lose, especially in a perfectionistic environment, because the appraisal of you is always going to be critical. It's because that's just what they are. And I think a different approach may be to look at that compassionately. I can't imagine in a workplace where there's a lot of perfectionists and a lot of criticism that anyone in that workplace is truly happy. They're spending 40, 60 plus hours a week miserable, and it's a tough place to be, and to start to look at that and say, I have compassion for these people because they're suffering. And I'm also going to update my resume at the same time because this isn't working for me. That could be a way to look at it.
Yeah, it's like maybe your values of like where you want to work is not jiving with what they're presenting you with, right? Maybe you want a more cooperative setting, or place where people are just nicer to each other, right? The other thing to think about is also like, what is your relationship to the work, right? Meaning, how much of that is part of your identity? It sounds like that was a tough situation, right? But how much of that is your identity? Is there a way to create a little more space? I don't know if creating that space might make it a little bit easier to deal with those people, but it may not, right? Again, it's the answer is not simple. You kind of have to look at a lot of different things. So, yeah. So I'm just looking at the time, and I think the meditation is like about 11 minutes or 12 minutes. So we may do like one more question, and then if you want to do the meditation, then we probably want to do that, right?
Hey, Parag and Megha, I really appreciated the presentation. I started to take notes and then I had to give up because I was like trying to write down every word that was being said. But when we were doing the activity about reflecting on a time where we felt that like perfectionist kind of mindset and like going back as far as we can, like what came to mind for me was just as a child always trying to like live up to my parents' expectations, and I was constantly looking for that like approval of like, oh, we're proud of you, or like, oh, you did the right thing. And I think it's a cultural thing that's not always verbalized. And like in our culture, like it's not necessarily said, but now that I've kind of grown up, I've realized like I'm still kind of seeking that approval. And when I try to have these conversations with my parents, it tends to get a little bit more emotional, or it gets like, they're like, oh, this is too dramatic. Like, this is not how we operate. And so how can I kind of come to that mindset of like, okay, I might not necessarily get that kind of pat on the back or like approval, but still trying to live up to their expectations, if that makes sense. Because I feel like there's some cultural kind of confusion there sometimes.
I think these comments were brought up earlier too when Parag was doing that presentation, the cultural piece, right? The community and the pressures that come with that, right? Yeah, I mean, I think the first step is just awareness, right? What is it bringing up for you, right? What would it mean for you to get that approval? You know, and you don't have to answer that.
Yeah.
But really just dissecting it, like really kind of being more curious about what's coming up for you. Really, what is it about this that is difficult for me, right? And what would it be like if I didn't need the validation, right? And also, I mean, there's a lot of layers to this, right? But yeah, there would be a lot of layers to this.
And I would say, I think,
yeah.
One of the things that we, and I think I would agree, this is very much kind of cultural, especially coming from an Indian culture. I hear this all the time. And I experience this in my own life as well. So it feels very familiar. And one way I might look at that is to recognize that that's what's happening, and to say at this point forward in time, that's not going to continue. Yeah. And so my own interactions with others, making a conscious point to say this isn't, this may have been how the past things were done, but it doesn't have to be the way going forward. And so even though we may not be able to change, like I mentioned with the workplace question, we may not be able to change others' behavior. But parents may not give you a pat on the back at some point. That may be what they're, that's not how they were raised potentially. But going forward, I will always be that person that will look at it differently. And that's a value that I have. I'm going to work through that as a value.
Yeah, and kind of piggybacking on that, like I think identifying the things that are important to you and focusing your energy on that, right, can be helpful in that. And then ultimately, once you kind of figure out, well, what is this approval thing about, right? Like, can you give that to yourself, right? Whatever those feelings are, whether it's safety or just I see you, right? Is that what it is? Like the approval is that the person is seeing you for who you are.
Yeah, I think it's also just sometimes the decisions we make and the paths we choose in life aren't exactly aligned to like what they're used to or what's conventional. So whenever we like kind of steer off road, it's like, no. Like, it's kind of like everything is just so hyper focused on that one thing that you're not following the path or the checklist or whatever. So it feels like if you do anything that's a little different, like, it's very concerning, I think, for them, from my opinion. So it's like, am I doing the right thing? Should I follow my own path? Or, how much do I have to keep doing what they prefer, if that makes sense?
Yeah, and I think this is where the values will really guide you, like what is important to you. And then once you were able to, or maybe you already have that, right? Once you're able to have that, then even if it's difficult, will go in the path that's important to you, that takes you where you want to go. And not to say that it's not going to be hard, right? But I think you'll feel like you kind of know where you're going and what's important to you. Yeah. So, okay. I think we should do the meditation.
Sure.
Yeah. Let's see if we're able to make it work. So we have to go back to the slide.
Right, and then we do a share screen.
And check the share sound button, or like the little checkbox in the corner. Perfect.
Thank you. Okay. Let's do stereo. Nice. Let's see here. So, okay, if you can see Vivekji's picture, launch an action. And we'll go back.
That's the last one. Yeah.
Okay. All right, fingers crossed.
The following meditation is led by Tara Brock. To access more of my meditations or join my email list, please visit tarabrock.com. As you come into stillness, take a few full breaths, a nice deep in-breath, and a slow out-breath. And again, a nice deep full in-breath, filling the chest, filling the lungs. And then a slow out-breath, feeling the sensations of the breath as you exhale. And then letting the breath resume in its natural rhythm. Just feel this body breathing. And take some moments to scan in your life. And you might notice where in your relationships with others or in your own behaviors you feel like you've turned on yourself in some way. You might be in a situation where you're in conflict with another person but feeling bad about yourself. It might be that you've turned on yourself, you're at war with yourself for a way that you're behaving as a parent, a partner, a friend. You might be judging yourself or down on yourself for something to do with work, or maybe it's for an addictive behavior. Where do you get into the trance of unworthiness, the trance of not okay? And let your attention go to that place where you know you get into the trance. And for now, just let yourself kind of get close into it so you can feel the sense of how it is to be living inside that mind state of the belief that in some way you're falling short, you should be different. Perhaps there's a sense of not lovable, not okay, not respectable. Something's wrong. We begin the reign of self-compassion by recognizing, oh, this is trance, at war with myself. Recognizing the thoughts and feelings of the trance. Just allowing that all to be here right now. We're making room for what's here. The A of Reign is just to allow, this is how it is right now. We begin to investigate with curiosity, with gentleness. Okay, so what's it like when I'm in this trance? And you might sense what you're believing about yourself and other people. If that comes quickly, just, what's the belief right there? I should be different. I'm bad because I'm hurting others. No one could love me. I'll always fail. Just sense what might be built in there, what kind of core belief. And most important, feel your body and sense when you're in the trance of unworthiness, what is it like in your body? What's your throat feel like, your chest, your belly, when you're really feeling bad about yourself? The most important part of investigating is connecting with the embodied experience. Sense the most vulnerable part of you, where you feel the worst. Sense what that part most needs. The part that feels deficient, not okay, what does it need? Does it need to be seen in a different way and loved, understood, held? Just sense that. And as you're listening into that, as you're feeling into that place in you that is feeling not okay, you might experiment with putting your hand on your heart. Just lightly, a very tender touch. And this is the beginning of turning towards loving, towards the N of Reign, the nourishing. And sense the possibility of offering what's most needed inwardly. Perhaps there's words that you might offer. Sometimes it's okay, sweetheart, or I'm sorry and I love you. Thich Nhat Hanh says, darling, I care about the suffering, is a powerful phrase. Or it might be as the minister that you sense the love of the God or the divine flowing through you, or for me, that kiss on the brow of pure care. Sense the possibility of calling on love and offering it inward. Nourish with self-compassion. Each time you nourish with self-compassion, let it be a fresh, creative exploration of what really allows you to feel love flowing into your own being. You might imagine light, warmth pouring in. Just the intention to offer care inwardly begins to decondition that tendency to be at war. The meditation becomes full when, after the steps of rain, we simply notice, who am I if I'm not any longer believing anything's wrong? Sensing that tenderness, the openness, the spaciousness of being when we're not at war. From the teachings of Bapuji, an Indian master, he says, "My beloved child, break your heart no longer. Each time you judge yourself, you break your own heart. You stop feeding on the love which is the wellspring of your vitality. The time has come, your time, to live, to celebrate, and see the goodness that you are. Let no one, no thing, no idea or ideal obstruct you. If one comes even in the name of truth, forgive it for its unknowing. Do not fight. Let go and breathe into the goodness that you are."
Wow, that was very powerful. And we're just going to let that simmer and just end the meeting now. There's no outro needed. Gratitude for sharing that with us. We really appreciate it. Hariom, everyone.
Thank you so much.